It's not that I don't think you can't speak to it. It's that you don't want to speak to it.
A conservative activist is calling the Republican Senate leadership to task for refusing to end the filibuster in order to resume funding the Department of Homeland Security.
Even though American service members have already given their lives in the ongoing war with Iran, Democrats continue to play politics, refusing to fund the DHS. Senate Majority Leader John Thune lambasted Senate Democrats for using the DHS shutdown as a political pawn. Gary Bowers, chairman of the Campaign for Working Families.
Shame on the National Democrat Party, shame on the Democrats in the United States Senate who continue to not fund the Department of Homeland Security when we are in the middle of a very high-risk time for terror attacks in the United States.
But Bauer says Republicans need to kill the filibuster while they still have control.
I continue to think that, sadly, the majority of Republican senators continue to think that as soon as President Trump is gone, that American politics will get back to the point where neither party does anything that violates tradition and so forth. They're dead wrong. If the Democrats get enough votes in the United States Senate, they will get rid of the filibuster. If you are an elected Republican official and you still don't understand that, you're too stupid to be involved in politics.
I'm Chad Groening.
There's more news online at afn.net and download the AFN mobile app for your Apple or Android device. I'm Rusty Pugh.
AFA Action takes attacks on the family seriously. The enemies of the family constantly employ new tactics to try to sneak past our radar. They know if we stand together, their evil plans will fail. Your gift to AFA Action allows us to stay vigilant against their onslaught. And if you give this month, you'll receive access to the Cultural Institute video When Your Faith is Illegal by Frank Harbor on AFA Stream as our thanks. You can make your gift today at afaaction.net.
Hey, 8 Days of Hope family. As God continues to expand this ministry, we cherish your involvement, whether that is through praying, volunteering, or donating. We know it can be hard to stay up to date on all that God is doing through 8 Days of Hope, and we'd hate for you to miss an opportunity to get involved. Today we invite you to find us on social media to see regular updates on how we are loving and serving those in need across the country through our Rebuilding, Rapid Response, Safe House, and Mass Feeding ministries. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Music at 8 Days of Hope. That's EIGHT, Days of Hope. If you aren't on social media, we invite you to join our text alerts. Right now you can text the word HOPE to 86373, and you'll be notified anytime we deploy or have exciting news to share. It's that simple. Text HOPE, that's HOPE, to 86373. We can't wait to share updates with you soon.
Jenna Ellis in the morning on American Family Radio.
I love talking about the things of God because of truth and the biblical worldview. The U.S. Constitution obligates our government to preserve and protect the rights that our founders recognize come from God, our Creator, not our government. I believe that Scripture in the Bible is very clear that God is the one that raised up each of you, and God has allowed us to be brought here to this specific moment in time.
This is Jenna Ellis in the morning.
Good morning. It is Thursday, March 5th, and as tensions are still escalating across the world and also across the country regarding the airstrikes in Iran and what exactly this means moving forward into 2026, a debate is brewing as well over the immigration policy that we have had and the immigration policy that we should have. And now for a long time, conservatives have kind of been of this mantra that legal immigration good and illegal immigration bad. But finally, I think we're kind of getting away from that simplistic of a narrative. And even Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt said yesterday on Fox News, if you don't align with the values of the United States and you don't respect our country, our culture, our laws, and our people, you are not welcome here. And this is a really strong statement from the Trump administration that hopefully members of Congress, including the new Sharia law caucus that is considering, who exactly are we importing? And their values, their worldview, their culture, their processes, their view of family, of government, all of these things that don't just come by default as human beings. These types of things need to be more thoroughly vetted, and not just vetted as in, okay, maybe you're not going to be, or we don't consider that you might be a domestic terrorist, or you might not be violent. And some of these people do end up becoming violent, years after they came here legally. And we've seen that as recently as this weekend in Texas, in Austin. We need to more thoroughly consider whether people who are coming into this country actually understand what it means to be the West, what it means to have a civil society that is founded on Judeo-Christian principles, what it means to have the nuclear family, what it means to have religious freedom in this country, what it means to have the U.S. Constitution. I mean, all of these things are being lost even by some who are born here. I mean, when we're seeing the great divide over politics right now, it's not just because of who we're importing, but it's also because of the worldview that we are importing. So let's welcome in Auron MacIntyre, who is a host at The Blaze. And Auron, I think there does need to be a very serious conversation about our immigration law, and not just closing loopholes for illegal immigration, for things like asylum, legal immigration for things like asylum, or more thoroughly vetting the mass deportations that President Trump promised. But I think we need to look more closely at even the world views that we are importing.
Oh, I agree 100%. We've had this ridiculous notion in our country for a very long time now that paperwork is what makes someone American. That's simply going through a process, getting some papers stamped, getting them filed somewhere. Now all of a sudden they're an American, and when they become an American, they'll just share all the values that Americans have. Once you're an American, you must just believe in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. You must believe that a moral and religious people are the foundation of the country, and that Christianity is the religion that should be informing that morality. But that's just not the case. For the majority of the world, actually, American values are not innate. They're not something that they understand in their core because they're not part of their tradition. And when you import people who do not have that tradition and do not have that understanding, they don't magically become Americans because they filed paperwork or they touched our soil. What you need is an understanding that there is a cultural continuity, a tradition, a heritage that reaches back and informs everything we believe in. The things we believe in are codified in the Constitution, and those things are critical and important, but they're a reflection of a longer tradition that we're tied to. And when you bring someone in from the Middle East who has centuries of Islamic belief on their side, they've lived that way, their entire family has lived that way, there are a few people who can come in and change that, but ultimately for most people, that is deeply rooted in who they are, and it's not going to change just because they crossed our border.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we do have that audio from Caroline Leavitt. This is what she said on Fox News. Listen to this.
President Trump has done more to crack down on illegal immigration and to strengthen our legal immigration system than any president in history. Several months ago, he announced a travel ban on 19 third world and failed state countries around the world. Secretary Noem announced tonight she's recommending that travel ban widens and covers more countries around the globe. Special immigrant visas, which we know many Afghans have used to come into our country, there has been a complete suspension and pause on all of those. If you look at the entire visa process in general, we have greatly strengthened and heightened the vetting process and requirements for that under Secretary Rubio's leadership at the State Department. And he has used his authority, which is unprecedented, to actually revoke the visas of many individuals who, yes, came here legally, but still pose a risk to our country and should have never been allowed in the first place. And I would just remind people around the world that coming to the United States of America is a privilege. privilege. It is not a right. And if you abuse that privilege, and if you don't align with the values of the United States, and you don't respect our country, our culture, our laws, and our people, you are not welcome here under the leadership of President Donald J. Trump.
And I totally agree with that, Auron. And I think even, to further your point, this type of worldview of American culture and of the values that we hold dear and the constitutional principles of our founding, that's not just a byproduct of coming here that somehow tacitly, we somehow get these values out of thin air. And that's also true for even the people who are citizens who, are not immigrants at all, but are Americans. This is a deeper problem even than immigration, because the left and Democrats as a whole are a segment of America that doesn't actually understand and hasn't assimilated to our values either. And I think we need to have a serious conversation about the divide in this country, where it's not just about importing the people that don't share our values, but importing the worldview that is not being passed on to the next generation. And this is why largely we're seeing a lot of the problems that we are in government and in policy and in so many other areas, because we're not even teaching our own children, by and large, the American way of life. We're importing a worldview from other religions or godless worldviews. And we wonder why America is on this precipice of, falling off the cliff, when it's so difficult to reason with someone that fundamentally doesn't share the same worldview.
It's so true. We misremember history. People will say, well, we assimilated the Germans and the Irish and the Italians, and so of course we could just assimilate anyone. But that's the wrong lesson to learn from that. We had to work really hard to assimilate all those groups, and they were largely European and Christian. I mean, we were to the point where we were still trying to break up German enclaves well up into almost World War II. It took 2 world wars before we truly assimilated the German people to be fully American. And again, they were much closer to our tradition. They at least shared our faith. When we're talking about people who are coming from the Middle East, believing in Sharia law, we're passing all these laws now. Greg Abbott is talking about banning Sharia law in Texas. And I agree with that. We should do that. But that misunderstands how the law works. When you import people who believe in Sharia law, you're going to get Sharia law no matter how much you ban it, because the law is, yes, a teacher, but it's also informed by the beliefs of the people who live in your country. So if you bring a bunch of people in who believe in that principle, even if you ban it, eventually it's going to come to power, because that's how a representative republic works. When you change what the people believe in, then their representatives will also change what they believe in. And so it matters who you bring in here. We can't just keep bringing people in with radically different worldviews, whether it be, secular humanism or radical Islam, and then expect us to maintain the different traditions that we've had here. The people matter. It's not just about the process.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And, the laws of any society reflect the values and the worldview of that society, from what we encourage, what we promote and incentivize, to also what we prohibit, what we criminalize, and what we say isn't okay. And we can see those differences between constitutional law, our supreme law of the land, versus Sharia law and that whole legal system. And we're even seeing aspects of that contradiction in so many of the blue states that have such ridiculous laws that, thankfully, at least the Supreme Court right now is mostly conservative, and they're willing to say, no, parental rights still matter. For example, the Supreme Court case this week commenting on California that, no, you can't just have teachers try to help, gender transition minors and keep parents out of the process. I mean, that is a law that fundamentally does not reflect an American worldview. And that's not just a problem with importing people. It's a problem with importing a different worldview than what America was founded on. And there was no real greater display this week, I think, of this contrast than Elizabeth Hasselbeck on The View, where the other women of The View just are screeching, demons. I mean, they are completely antithetical to a truthful biblical worldview. And Elizabeth Hasselbeck basically shifted the Overton window for what's acceptable to be said on The View. This is, coming from a social media account, and she was on the panel as they were trashing Kristi Noem, and she was talking about ironclad arguments for the border, that if you're in a context, Auron, where, the other people at least fundamentally agree with your worldview, we just disagree on policy, this wouldn't be such a grenade that she's throwing to, Joy Behar and Whoopi Goldberg and the rest. It would be we all agree on the principles of America, and then we can discuss how best to implement policy that reflects that worldview. But right now, we're at a point in the country where we don't agree on the fundamental values. I don't think we could get Congress right now to unanimously agree even on the language of the Declaration of Independence. I mean, that's how far off the rails we have gone. And so listen to what Elizabeth Hasselbeck has said. This is cut 4.
I think all lives matter to God. And we're in uncommon times, so we need to have uncommon sense about things like this. Yes, there will be mistakes made, but I think if Kristi Noem were up for promotion right now and she put forward the statistics that 0 illegals released into the U.S. for 10 months straight have not crossed, okay, that nearly 3 million aliens have left the United States, that we have the lowest murder rate in 125 years, that fentanyl trafficking is down 56% at the border, and daily encounters have gone down 96%. Hang on one second. We need a strong border, especially now with our current global situation. And I believe that you may say you don't want border control and you're against ICE, but I actually don't believe you in your daily lives. How many people in the audience here had to go through security to get here? Raise your hand. Just be honest. Otherwise, you go to jail, I guess, for illegal trespassing, right? This is an authorized audience. They had to go through security to get through the border, to get right here, to just hear us talk. We need strong borders more than ever right now. We are being infiltrated.
But listen, can I give you on the border when Renee Good and Alex Peretti were murdered, and death is not a mistake. That was a murder. No, that was a murder. Now let me finish.
As were those killed by illegal immigrants. Murder.
And then it just goes on, and of course, immediately she's attacked by like all of the screeching, ladies on the panel. But Auron, to this point, she's just speaking facts, and nobody wants to hear that because the worldview of the rest of the panel is so anti-American.
Yeah, I mean, she's of course making very logical arguments, but logic is not the problem here. I think most people, if you walk them through the basics of you lock your door, you have a gate around your house, maybe you live in a gated community, like they understand this at some level, but first they just hate President Trump and the people that he represents. And so they're kind of de facto going to oppose this, even though for a very long time, immigration was a problem for Democrats back when Democrats used to pretend about labor and, pretend like they cared about the working class. They understood that immigration was devastating to the working man. And yet now they fully support it because Donald Trump, or they fully oppose any immigration control because Donald Trump supports it. It's not that they don't get at some level the concept, but ultimately they don't care. They don't believe in things like assimilation. They don't believe in the idea that there needs to be a singular cultural idea in the United States. They want to watch the whole thing come apart. That's the point. They want the multiculturalism. They want 1,000 little places where people are living different lives, living different ways. They think that somehow that's a benefit, even though that's literally been a nightmare all throughout history. You need something that holds the culture together, as we were speaking about previously. Those traditions, those understandings, they don't just randomly arise the minute you cross in the United States. But for the View and much of their audience, that's not it. It's an emotive process. Somebody, I hate my dad, and Trump looks kind of like my dad, and he's telling me I can't have what I want, and that's why he's wrong.
Yeah, well, and Auron, we've got to take a break here. So much more could be said on this topic. But, the bottom line is that not only do we have to have more thorough vetting, we need to seriously consider who is actually beneficial to this country, but I'm going to also suggest that we need to assimilate even American citizens into this country, because people like these women on The View, they don't actually share fundamental American values because they are so anti-America, anti-God, anti-everything that America stands for. They haven't actually assimilated either. And that doesn't mean, of course, we'd say we deport them or, any of those things. But the point is, we need to be educating our children to understand what it actually means to be an American, and that's centered on truth, the biblical worldview, and understanding the legitimate view of government, so that then when we get to these policy conversations, we can all actually agree on truth. We'll be right back.
They're coming for your family, not with guns, not with armies, but with laws, with lawsuits, with ballots and bureaucrats. Parental rights are under attack. Marriage is being redefined. Your values, they want them silenced, and they're counting on you to do nothing. But here's the thing, we're not backing down. I'm Walker Wildman, and AFA Action is in the fight, in the legislature, in the courtroom, and at the ballot box. We're stopping bad legislation, we're challenging activist judges, and through iVoter Guide, we're helping Christians vote like it matters, because it does. Thousands of families are already standing with us, and I believe the American family is still worth fighting for. But we can't do it without you, and we need your help today. Visit afaaction.net right now. Give today. Join us on the front lines, because the other side isn't slowing down, and neither can we. afaaction.net. Your voice, your values, your vote.
According to a recent study of hundreds of post-abortive women, 60% of women reported that they would have preferred to give birth if they had received more support from others or had more financial security. And that's where Preborn steps in. Meet Kelsey, a brave young woman who chose life after meeting her child on ultrasound.
I ended up deciding to keep my son, who is now 5 years old today. I love him to pieces. He brings absolute joy to my heart. I could not imagine life without him. Not only did they help me save his life, they saved my life.
When you support Preborn, you support a woman to make a choice that she won't have to regret for the rest of her life, and give her the ultimate blessing, life. To learn more about Preborn's life-saving work, dial pound 250 and say the keyword baby. That's pound 250 baby. Or visit preborn.com/AFR.
Hello, Americans. I'm Todd Starnes. Stand by for news and commentary next. The baseball team at Northport High School in Sarasota, Florida, facing the wrath of atheists. The baseball team has a chaplain affiliated with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes. Well, the other day, the local chapter posted a message on Facebook saying they were praying over every coach and player. Well, that outraged the Freedom from Religion Foundation, a Wisconsin-based group of atheist predators. They target towns and communities on a mission to remove Christianity from the public marketplace. Now, the atheists say it's unconstitutional for athletic programs to let an adult serve as a chaplain, and they're calling on the district to investigate and ban the FCA. Let's hope the school district has an attorney who understands religious liberty, because there's nothing unconstitutional about a high school baseball team having a chaplain. This time, the atheist struck out. I'm Todd Starnes.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis in the Morning on American Family Radio.
Welcome back. And California Governor Gavin Newsom said yesterday that President Trump knows Republicans will, quote, get crushed in this year's midterms, touting his state's approval of a redistricting proposal in November that handed more seats to Democrats. This coming from The Hill. And Newsom said Trump is an historic president, historically unpopular, who's going to get crushed, shellacked in the midterms. He's toast, and he knows it. Why else did he call Texas Governor Greg Abbott, saying he's, quote unquote, entitled to 5 seats in a mid-decade redistricting? This was was a conversation between Newsom and Jimmy Kimmel, of all people, because he knows that anybody else with half a brain would have laughed him out of that interview. But meanwhile, everyone is wondering on the right whether Trump will weigh in on the Texas runoff for Senate between incumbent John Cornyn and challenger Ken Paxton. And, it's funny, Politico reported this morning, Capitol agenda, nervous GOP waits for Trump's Texas pick. One of the Texas members, actually, of the legislature that I know very well, won't name who it is, but texted me that and said, no one inside of Texas is nervous, with a laughing face emoji, literally no one, because at least according to this rep, people want Paxton anyways, and really, that's not going to go well for Trump if he endorses Cornyn. I hope that is actually the case. But, midterms are really up in the air on a lot of fronts. I think it's going to be kind of a wild year. But let's welcome in Matthew Peterson, who is the former chief editor at The Blaze, and he also is a Washington Fellow at the Claremont Institute. So, Matthew, overall, what's your thought on Gavin Newsom suggesting? I mean, it's obviously just a cover that he's suggesting that the mid-decade census is somehow just about getting more Republican seats when it's actually about getting an accurate vote count, and Republicans, I think, are actually owed more seats. But overall, your thoughts on this and the midterms in general?
Well, thanks for having me on, Jenna. I mean, Newsom is so out of control, and you can see that regardless of Republican concerns about the midterms, you can see the Democrats talking with a lot of bravado because they know that their base is riled up. But the fundamental fact is they don't have leaders that excite the majority of the electorate. They still don't have a majority coalition coming out of last year's election. So they're in trouble. And they're in trouble in part because their scheme with the census has been called for the first time in a long time. People have been talking about how they've skewed the census results, they've manipulated the data, and they've done it in a way that's very favorable, no surprise, to Democrats. And the fact that in Washington we're finally putting an end to that game is upsetting to them. And, that's too bad. That's going back to the principles of fairness that America is based on and making sure that we have secure and safe elections. So, kudos to the Trump administration for that. There's got to be a lot more work done there. But, Newsom is talking about this because they're afraid of the results.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Democrats for a long time have just tried to game the system in so many different ways, and they haven't been held accountable on it. And it seems like Donald Trump, with all of the other ways that, I wish he actually would hold some people accountable, and, whether people want to call that retribution or just going after justice, I think there are some things that, he should be doing. But I think that this in particular is something that not only affects the entire nation, but is just requiring Democrats to play by the rules. And that's just something that they're not accustomed to, and they haven't been doing for a really long time.
No, and I mean, I think most people, it's hard to even wrap your mind around the fact that these blue states are, welcoming in illegal immigrants so that they can count in the census. And it reminds one of slavery. It's like slave states, wanting to count all the slaves so that they have more power, so that they can commit more acts of injustice. And that's, that's really what it boils down to. So there's a lot of other ways in which they skew the census, but they're concerned about that. They're screaming and shouting about it. But the fact remains that they don't have the kind of leadership they need. And outside of blue states, where they've, really engineered the system, these one-party states, they're still in the same trouble they were before. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not going to be a backlash on their side. They're definitely ready to come out and vote. And, of course, they're, activated against Donald Trump. But the question remains, the midterms, is that going to be enough to put them over the top in the places where it matters?
Yeah, and that really is the question. And how do you analyze that?
Well, I think a lot of this depends upon, the first fundamental fact about the midterms is the president is not directly on the ballot, right? And President Trump, what he's historically done is brought historic numbers of voters to the polls, Republicans who are disenchanted with Republicans. and others who weren't Republican but wanted to vote for Donald Trump. That is his superpower. So if he's not on the ballot, the first thing Republicans have to do is say, okay, well, how are we going to bring people to the polls? And here we come to Texas. I moved from California to Texas 5 years ago. So I have a time spent in both states. And Texas is a bellwether in that respect, because the question is, which direction does the Republican Party move? And what I would say, Jenna, is that if people are going to be motivated to come out and vote in the midterms and Trump's not on the ballot, you're going to have to find people who motivate them. And for the base on the right, that means candidates like Ken Paxton, who they see as someone who is against the system and is not an establishment Republican. And that's why I think you said someone texted you about this. That's why in Texas, you're just not going to get the excitement for John Cornyn, because that base is not going to come out for him. They're sick of those kinds of Republicans. And so that's the situation you see Republicans in across all these states. The people who get the base excited are the ones who are anti-establishment Republicans. And so contrary to D.C. wisdom, which will be, we have to run moderates to win the middle. Well, that's not what happened in the last presidential election. And I think the same logic applies in the midterms.
Yeah, I agree. And then, I was just saying as well, Kyle Rittenhouse posted, if Trump endorses Ken Paxton, I'm voting for Ken Paxton. If Trump endorses Cornyn, I'm voting for Ken Paxton. And I think, with a lot of the comments, and this already got over 16,000 likes. And of course, that's people outside of Texas. But, this is really going to test whether Trump's endorsements really are holding. But, this also goes back to, we've been through a midterm cycle, Matthew, that Trump has been president and he's not on the ballot. Obviously, in 2018, he had a re-election forthcoming. That's obviously the difference in a second term midterm. But when elections were held in 2018, the Republicans lost the majority in the House and lost the trifecta. So, we do have some precedent, but I think we're also in a very different situation just in terms of the overall sentiment of what's going on in the world than we were in 2018. Just from a post-2020 perspective, the world, it just has changed in so many ways since 2020.
Yeah, I think you're right. And of course, historically, it is definitely the case that when you get to the midterms, there's usually a correction. Often, the other side comes out to vote from whoever's president. And so if the Democrats president, the Republicans come out and vice versa. And you get a kind of correction where often, in Congress, the other party takes over. And that's just the nature of a divided America and a two-party system. So you would expect to see some Democratic gains in the midterms. But I agree that we are in a different scenario because, in a way, there's almost 3 or 4 political parties. When it comes to the Democrats, they're captured by a radical faction that just does not let go, and they're not able to tame. And then you have your kind of run-of-the-mill Democrat who's, against the wokeness but still is anti-Republican. And then on the right, you have I think the base now is solidly. They're not voting, Jenna. This is a problem, I think, with D.C. Republicans. They're not voting for Republicans. They're voting for something new. And, Trump is sometimes an imperfect catalyst for this, but Trump represents, and it has from the beginning, a rejection of the old Republican Party. People are sick of those guys and that attitude and a lot of those policy positions. So, that's what happened in the last election was really a new coalition that was a majority coalition saying, we reject the wokeness, we reject this craziness, we want to move in a different direction. And I think that Republicans misunderstand that at their own peril. For the base, for the people who are excited to come out and vote, they do not want people like John Cornyn who do not represent the Texas values, and they understand that people like him speak out of both sides of their mouth, and they pretend that they're, with Trump or whatever, and then they go to D.C. and they vote in the uniparty way. So people are definitely sick of that. On the other hand, you do have Democrats very riled up that literally Hitler, right, is in office. And so how many of them are there? We'll find out.
Yeah, I'm speaking with Matthew Peterson, who is a Washington Fellow at the Claremont Institute, my special guest this morning. And I think it was a very interesting point that we really do have multiple parties, not just Republicans versus Democrats, because both sides within the base of Democrats or the base of Republicans have fractured splits, and that's being shown a lot in this sort of America first versus America only on the right, and maybe characterized as well by the fracture that's always been there of the old establishment versus MAGA, however we can now define either of those terms. But then on the Democrat side, you do have the really, really extreme leftists, and then you have people like Fetterman, who almost sounds like a conservative, or at least reasonable. But so how does the Democrat Party deal with somebody like a James Tallarico, who is now become, a national standard bearer for the future of the Democrat Party? I mean, the moderates, or the people who, if there are any reasonable Democrats left besides John Fetterman, they have to be very nervous about a lot of the rhetoric that is coming out, and that somebody like that, I hope and I don't expect that he would actually win in Texas. And if he doesn't, is that a commentary on the fact that the left just can't push too far down the rabbit hole?
I think it is. So in James Tallarico, you have someone who is, almost hatched in a lab for the old Democratic woke way. And it's really interesting, because here is a guy who speaks in religious language, but does not speak in a way any traditional Christian takes the word of God in, and is essentially, woke as they come, and has now, in the last 24 hours, you see Twitter exploding with people finding his old comments, and they're just wackadoodle. I mean, this is way out there stuff that is not going to appeal to most Texans. But see, he's hatched in a lab because he's a creature of the culture machine. I mean, this is a guy who's been groomed to run for office because he went to fancy schools and he's articulate. And they think that because he has white skin, that somehow he's more electable. That's what I can see. It's like, he's some kind of Manchurian candidate. He's very woke, but he's a very articulate white man, and we'll run him. This isn't authentic at all. This is not how people think. Regular people are smarter than this, and they'll figure it out. But they have put him on the talk show circuit. They built him up into this huge star, and I think he is a test of whether or not this inauthentic approach can work. And I don't think it can, Jenna. I really don't. And I think that they have to really go back to the drawing board, because what people are sick of is the inauthentic, like, fake candidate who presents one way and it's, works through indirection to try to convince you of who they are. People are really tuned into that. And I don't think it's going to work. I think that what you see now is a lot of people in D.C. saying, oh, my gosh, the Republicans too. Like, he's such a strong candidate. We don't know if he's a strong candidate at all. I don't think he is in any way whatsoever. We'll find out. I mean, people are saying he's Timo Beto. I think that's right. I mean, Beto didn't work. Texas has reddened. And if you're going to convince people, you're going to need someone who is more authentic and says what they mean and means what they say.
Yeah, that's a great point that we can't forget about Beto and how spectacularly he failed multiple times, which was really great, actually. And hopefully Texas will be able to tell the difference. And, I posted on social media yesterday as well in the wake of Tallarico's win. If anyone in Texas confuses Tallarico for an actual Christian, we have way bigger problems than his quote unquote brand. And, this is just the thing about him that really irks me, is that he's going out and spouting his ridiculous leftist rhetoric under the auspices of running as a Christian and somehow kind of a moderate. I really don't think that's going to resonate with the actual Christians in Texas at all.
No, and this is what I mean by inauthentic. You hit the nail on the head. It is that here's someone who, just because they use Christian language and go to what must be an extremely woke church and talk about how trans people can have abortions too, and that abortion is okay and actually in line with Christianity, this is not going to, win over people. This will simply speak to whoever goes to, the woke churches, which are not the majority of churches in a place like Texas. And it's not going to convince anyone else otherwise. They're just going to say, oh, my gosh, this guy is someone who is really using the Bible in ways that are horrific. So, but that's the tactic. I mean, this is the level of thought that goes into both Republicans and Democrats who are in Washington or are establishment and have been around a while in red states and blue states, and they don't have to think very hard about getting elected. And that's the problem. That's just not going to work anymore. I think they're going to have to do better.
Yeah, so well said. Well, we have to take a break here. Matthew Peterson, thank you so much for stopping by. And, there was a commentator on X, not sure if he's from Texas or not, but he said, I don't think Republicans realize how dangerous Tallarico will be as a Democratic presidential candidate. Already jumping there, didn't we see what happened, though, with Beto? Everybody said that about him, too. And then goes on to say Tallarico, is well-spoken, white, and running as a quote-unquote Christian. His brand will be very tough for most Republican candidates to beat. Well, I hope that he goes the way of Beto and people see right through that. We can't just look at how well someone speaks on social media or on the media. We actually have to investigate their policies, where they stand, and whether or not they are an actual Christian. Because, just like what is a woman, we can answer that definitively. We can also ask and answer definitively that question, what is a Christian? We'll be right back.
We don't have to be like the 10 that said it can't be done, it's too big, the Giants are too big. We need to be like Joshua and Caleb and say, you know what, there are giants. This is a massive problem. When you have a nation that is ignorant of the principles that produce a free society, start where you can. It's the only way I know. It's a little bit at a time.
Join Walker Wildman and Rick Green as they tackle today's issues from a biblical and a constitutional perspective. At the Core, 1 p.m. Central weekdays on AFR.
If we lose this cultural war, we're going to have a hedonistic, humanistic society.
Discover the story of the culture warrior Don Wildman and how he went head-to-head with Hollywood, Playboy, the homosexual agenda, and the Disney Empire. The movement Don started paved the way for Christians to boldly stand for truth and righteousness in a hostile culture. Watch Culture Warrior today for free. Visit culturewarrior.movie.
What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. My name is Abraham Hamilton III, and this is the Hamilton Minute. According to the World Health Organization, abortion was the leading cause of death worldwide in 2018. As of December 31st, 2018, 41.9 million babies were murdered in the womb. That's more than the 8.2 million people who died from cancer, more than the 5 million who died from smoking, and more than the 1.7 million who died from HIV/AIDS in 2018 globally combined. Thomas Jefferson once said, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Lord, please strengthen us to abolish this wickedness.
Listen each weekday from 5 to 6 p.m. Central for the Hamilton Corner with Abraham Hamilton III, Public Policy Analyst for the American Family Association.
The following is a real-life story from Trinity Debt Management.
I had a lot of credit card debt, and it stressed me out. But what I thought was a solution turned out to be a problem. I kept hearing ads about debt settlement that seemed too good to be true. And actually, it was. When I called, they told me to stop paying my bills. That didn't sound right to me at all, so I hung up. Later, I found out that debt settlement is bad, real bad. Then I learned that there is a right way to pay off your credit cards. It's called a debt management program from the great team at Trinity. Trinity had a plan. In the end, I paid off my bills, I saved thousands, and I even improved my credit score.
If credit card debt has you down, call Trinity at 1-800-788-1813.
My name is Heather. Please forget debt settlement and remember Trinity Debt Management.
1-800-788-1813.
Welcome back to Jenna Ellis in the Morning on American Family Radio.
Welcome back. And, I was thinking this morning over my first cup of coffee, Yes, emphasizing first that, there are so many different aspects of this whole problem of the left versus the right that does boil down to a worldview issue. But, when we have people in office like Donald Trump, or I was thinking about my friend Dan Bongino, who's now, back in the private sector, and everybody kind of criticized him for not doing enough while he was in the FBI. And I think that's ridiculous. I think he did as much as he could. And therein lies the problem, right? Because in our system of government, we have a wonderful cap on what any one individual may or may not do. Now, of course, a good president can accomplish more than a bad president, and there is a lot of power and authority that comes with especially a presidential office, a governor's office, or a congressional seat, and so forth. But the point of our republic is to divide and separate power so that one person can't do everything. And that becomes actually a problem in a sense. And I think, this is where our founders anticipated that more than not, good men would be in these positions of authority. And when you have a proliferation of really bad actors, not just in elected offices, but even appointed on the U.S. Supreme Court, for example, which is basically an oligarchy that we're under at this point, and then what we would call the deep state, which is all of these hires that are not political appointees, so they just continue administration to administration. We saw a lot of that being uncovered with DOGE in terms of, budget and all of these other things. It becomes, I think, a problem in scale when you have so many people out of the hundreds of thousands that even just work in the federal government that by and large are not actually working for American principles and a conservative constitutional ethos, right? And if we had even a simple majority of people in all of these positions, including the governmental hires, that were actually doing the work of from a conservative worldview, which of course is grounded in truth, then we would see more aspects of government that was actually operating and functioning well, instead of basically just having to have some of these political positions that are appointed, like Bongino, the deputy FBI director, just doing as much as he can to kind of stem this tide. So the question, then becomes, all right, it's a good thing that we have a constitution that separates and limits power. But when we have a constitution now in 2026 that's been amended several times that in not a good direction, I'm thinking specifically of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th in particular, the 16th Amendment with, income tax and being able to, that Congress can just spend money on anything. We have all of these things that actually are antithetical to a worldview that our founders intentionally embedded initially. Where do we actually go from here? So let's welcome in Mike Donnelly, who is a constitutional law professor and attorney, and one of my favorite people to philosophize with. So, Mike, thanks so much for joining me for this conversation. And, it kind of just struck me anew this morning that, we tend to think, man, Trump isn't getting enough done. Bongino's not getting enough done. The Kristi Noem isn't getting enough done. But the problem is what started out as a good thing. And I think it's become a problem mainly because we have not passed on the worldview of the founders sufficiently to our own citizens. And then we've imported, as we were talking about at the beginning of the show, we've imported individuals and also a mindset that is completely antithetical to our founding. And so, of course, we're in a disaster right now.
No, absolutely, Jenna. I mean, it's very well said. And when you talk about the 16th and 17th Amendments, you're just like throwing red meat to the lion to a guy like me. Of course, I believe the 16th and the 17th need to be repealed. And when you talk about importing people, we're not just importing people. People are invading. The Supreme Court's going to have an opportunity on April 1st to consider the question of birthright citizenship, which is something I've been doing some reading and writing about recently in preparation for that. And, that's an important question. Who are we letting into our country? How are they getting in here? Should they be allowed to stay? And who is a citizen? This question of citizenship, I think, is really important. And I don't think we've grappled with it. And you'd think after 250 years, we'd know what a citizen is. But the thing is, it's changed over time. Through federal law. And of course, you mentioned the 14th Amendment, there's so much to say about the 14th Amendment. But on this question, what does the 14th Amendment say about citizenship? It says persons who are born or naturalized in the United States, right? That's where it stops, right? No, it doesn't stop there. It says, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. And that's the question the Supreme Court is going to be grappling with on April 1st when it takes up the Barber v. Trump case. People may remember, President Trump issued an executive order back in January 20th, the sign-a-thon, where he was at the Resolute desk hour after hour signing executive order after executive order. And one of those was the birthright citizenship order. And it shouldn't be surprising to people that he was going to do that, because in 2023, he criticized this whole idea of just giving people automatic universal birthright citizenship. He said that's a reward for breaking the laws of the United States, and obviously a magnet helping draw the flood of illegals across our borders. And so he issued that order. It was sued immediately by the ACLU. That resulted in the case Trump v. Casa that struck down universal injunctions by district courts. Then the ACLU said, well, we can do a class action lawsuit, and that's what they did. And so now we have Barber v. Trump, Supreme Court, April 1st, a really momentous case, I think, about what it means to be a citizen of the United States. I mean, you talk about the founders of this country and the question of citizenship, you've got to talk about a couple things. You got to talk about what did they mean, but you also have to look at the 14th Amendment, and you have to say, well, what did they mean? And it's not just a question of, well, is there a contrast? And there's a little bit of contrast, but I think it was more of an evolution. And I think the framers of the 14th Amendment understood what the founders who wrote the Declaration meant when it came to citizenship. And what they meant was not what they fought against, which was the British Crown's view of citizenship. And it actually wasn't a view of citizenship. It was a view of subjectship. And that's what we fought the Revolutionary War to throw off. We threw off the idea of subjectship in favor of citizenship. And those are two very different things. Very different things.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it is fascinating that in 2026, we're still grappling with this question of, what is a citizen? Apparently we're still grappling with the question, what is a woman? But that definition hasn't changed over time, right? That definition can't change. But, what is a citizen can be further refined. And the fact that we've never really pinpointed this, and we're grappling with this question in the midst of, Democrats who clearly have use the importing of immigrants for their own purposes. I mean, we look at the, Somali fraud. We look at how, they've tried to use the census. I mean, so many different examples of basically manipulating the rules to their benefit. These questions are incredibly important. And I think that it's a little too simplistic when we as conservatives just say, well, the U.S. Constitution overall, and then by that, we also mean, the 14th, 16th, 17th Amendments, is what we should defend. Because I think what we're missing, if we just say that broadly, is where we've gone wrong in even authorizing, some of the things that have gotten us into this mess. And I'm with you, and we've talked about this, quite a bit on this show, and certainly offline as well for years, how, the 16th and 17th Amendments should be repealed. And there is a process for that, and we should be advocating for that. And so, overall, and we're almost out of time, we need to have a longer conversation on this one, Mike, but, overall, where are we at in 2026 when we have a Supreme Court that is going to tell us, potentially, what is a citizen, and we will be subject to that definition instead of really genuinely being ruled by we the people.
Well, that's really great, Jenna, because the Declaration talks about this, right? And I want people to understand there's two views on this subject, and the American view is neither one of them. We do things our own way. We do things in an exceptional way. There's one rule, which is the British rule, which says you're born into the kingdom and immediately and automatically and forever subject to the king. There's another rule which says, well, the status of your parents is what matters, and so it descends through the blood, right? The founders rejected both of those. The founders said, no, we're setting up a government that is instituted among men, quote, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That means there has to be an element of consent involved. And they also said in the Constitution, we are getting rid of all titles of nobility, which is hereditary bloodlines, right? We're getting rid of that. We reject both of these views because we are going to be citizens, and it is by consent. And they understood very much that people had the right of expatriation, meaning that people can give their consent to be governed by anyone they want. It's a choice. But it's not just their choice. People don't get just to come here and say, yeah, I'm going to be an American citizen and I get all the free stuff. No. It means you come here legally with our consent, our knowledge or awareness, and you agree to give allegiance to the United States of America, to the sovereign. So it's a mutual reciprocal relationship. And so there's two views. I think the American view is the one in the middle. We'll see what the Supreme Court says, but that is what it is. Now, 14th Amendment is what they're going to be interpreting in light of the entire history and tradition of the country. And we'll see what they say. I think it looks good for the president, but we'll see what the Supreme Court says. You never can tell what Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett are going to do with these guys. But that's kind of where we're at. And the thing is, Congress does get to have a say here, right? Because Section 5 of the 14th Amendment gives Congress the authority to enforce it. So, the Supreme Court's going to say what it's going to say. Congress will have an opportunity to opine on that. In fact, Congress has actually tried to do this. And you talk about the Democrats. Well, the Democrats...
Well, and we're already out of time.
Are the ones who started it. Okay, good.
Yeah, we're already out of time. But yeah, so, this is so important. We'll continue this conversation. Reach me and my team, Jenna, at afr.net.
The views and opinions expressed in this broadcast may not necessarily reflect those of the American Family Association or American Family Radio.